Welcome everyone, and without further ado, I'll hand it straight over to Paul.
Hey, thanks, Wayne. Good morning for those of you in the Southern Hemisphere, and I believe that some people in the Northern Hemisphere are joining us, so it's good evening. Thank you, first of all, Wayne and the Australian Working Patrol Dog Association for allowing me or invite me and then allowing me to give this presentation today, and I appreciate everyone that's joined us. I'm going to share my screen, and then you can see that the presentation predominantly is going to be made up of slides and video. And, you know, when I first was asked to do this presentation, I kind of thought, all right, it's going to be law enforcement and military and that type of audience. But I know from some of the people that actually said they were going to attend this presentation that it's made up with different classifications of canine handlers. So I know there's some search and rescue and others joining. And for that reason, I've kind of made this an overview of detection rather than focusing on military and law enforcement. So I'm hoping that everyone gets something out of this rather than a few people getting everything out of this. So it's going to cover a variety of topics, but they're all lessons that I've learned over the years in operational deployments and training. And some of it is based on some of the research that we've done, scientific research into olfaction. So first of all, I better introduce myself. My name is Paul Bunker, and I am the principal of Chiron Canine. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm British, English, but I actually live in San Antonio, Texas. And Chiron Canine is my company, which has now been running just under 4 years. And basically, I concentrate or focus on detection, both consulting and training. Do around 50% of my work is research. 40% would be field deployments. And then 10% I do training workshops and seminars and those sort of things, law enforcement. And I'm a certifier for the Transport Security Administration third-party cargo screening, canine screening program. So kind of a mixed bag, although a lot of my work now is devoted to detection research. And we'll talk about some of the things that I've learned either through research or, as I said, lessons learned in the field. If you look at that photograph on the first screen, that's actually up in Canada. That was, the red flags are responses that my dog gave during a survey after an oil spill. And I have oil spill response dogs or oil canine detection dogs, so they can do leaks and spills. But what's happened here is that underneath that mud is a huge mat of oil. And this search was the year after the spill. So there'd been a winter incident, which up there in Canada is severe. And actually they get up to 6 meters of ice on this river during winter period. And then it thaws over the summer. And of course, there's a big surge of water that travels down, etc. So the oil that was stranded on the sediment actually got covered in mud. So as we were searching this river, my dog started to respond along the edges of this mud flat. And you can see there about every 10 meters where there's a flag is where she gave a sit response, and I marked it and then continued round. And both the right-hand side and the left-hand side, those red circles, they're also marker flags.
Sorry, Paul, your screen's not sharing.
Oh, okay, I'll try again. How are we now?
That's better. Yeah, the slides are up now.
Okay. All right. My apologies. Technology. So as I was saying, that mud flat, it's got the marker flags left and right. And you can clearly see that's where the dog gave me responses. But typically, you know, if you're an explosive detection dog handler or a drugs dog handler or even search and rescue, unless you're at a severe crash scene like a plane crash or something, you're not really going to experience these types of responses that are just one after another over a huge area of odor. And she was right, you know, when they dug the pits, they found that that whole bank was a oil mat about 6 inches to a foot under that mud. So a lot of the field experience that I've been able to generate was fairly new to me in that, you know, I've been doing this for 40 years, and predominantly things like explosive and drugs detection. And yet in the oil detection field, I've never experienced a detection dog doing these sort of mass area finds like this. So, you know, some of what I have learned has been a legacy of the type of work that I've done. And hopefully I can express some of that to you so that you know where some of this background information comes from. A little introduction then. I was British Army for 22 years. I was a canine in British Army, a dog trainer. And when I retired, I was asked to set up a program for the Department of Defense in the US. I came over for 1 year, an off-leash detection program. I did that. And then I became an instructor at the school in Lackland, San Antonio, Texas, for about 6 years in off-leash detection. And then I went up to North Carolina. I did the combat tracking course for a year as the instructor. And then I joined a commercial company up there and moved from program manager, a project manager for handler training, and then program manager for research and development. And that was predominantly in detection. It wasn't invasive research. It was all things like homemade explosives, buried explosives, cognition, nutrition, and those sort of things. And then I eventually became director of the school for a year before I decided I wanted to move back into dogs and get back to what I love. So then I started the company, as I said, about 4 years ago. Now that photo's from a couple of the guys, but there is 3 guys in the team up in Bihać in Bosnia. This was a landmine detection program. And really my current understanding of detection started back then when we started the landmine detection program, because prior to this, the way we trained explosive detection dogs, and some of you will probably cringe at this, was we would take explosives and drugs, whatever we were training, put them in a PVC pipe with holes in or a metal pipe, and then throw them down the road or into the field. The dog would go and retrieve it, bring it back, and then we hid the pipe, and the dog would go and try and find its toy, and it would scratch, dig, bark, etc. Yep, even with explosives. And that's how we train the dogs. And it just happened that I had an opportunity to attend a civilian police instructor's course in explosive detection for a month. And I went along and they were training the passive response. And after I'd done my course with them, I brought the passive response back, and we were just starting this landmine detection program, which clearly you need a passive dog. So I was able to introduce it into the British military school, as well as some other techniques, clicker being one of them, and some other things. And that really opened my eyes to the capabilities that we could actually train dogs, because when I started training, it was the old method of jerk the lead and good boy, and there was no Kong toys. We certainly didn't use food. I mean, my training sergeant told me, if you ever use food, it means you're a terrible dog trainer. So I was scared to use food to train dogs. I never wanted to be a terrible dog trainer. Now, you know, I use tons of foods, and we'll talk about that. But my background kind of started back then, but it was this project that really opened my eyes to dog training and the capabilities of dogs that we could tap into. So quite a bit of what I talk about today comes from those days of that project, and spending a lot of time really honing these dogs to be experts in detection. Because, you know, if you go into a live minefield, you don't need a dog that's 90% effective. It's got to be 100%. And, you know, we were fortunate that prior to deployment, we did independent assessments with the Royal Engineers, and the dogs were amazing. So, you know, it did teach me a lot. And so the first thing I'm going to talk about is the communication chain. And this is, I never invented the communication chain. I mean, it exists, although predominantly it's spoken about in human. And if you look at the table on there under human, When we talk about the communication, we have a source, and in this case, it's like me, I'm the speaker. I'm the source of communication right now. The message, it's what I'm saying. So we're talking about detection. And then the medium is how that message is moved. In this case, obviously, it's over a microphone and whatever the internet is, and arriving in all over the world so you could hear it. The receiver is you, every one of you. You're receiving this information, and then your interpretation is your understanding of what I'm saying. Clearly, I'm speaking English, and if you didn't understand English, you wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. So, you know, we have this communication chain. It's well known about, but what I did do is take this and apply it to detection dogs, and I think it fits very well. And I'll talk about why I think that, and also why you should use it in problem solving. But if we think about the communication in detection dogs, or the communication chain, we have a source, which is the target that we train the dog to find. The message that that source is giving out is the odor. And then the medium that that message has to move through, well, there's soil, sand, air, water, whatever it is, that actually transports that odor through the environment. The receiver, in this case, it's going to be the dog and the dog's nose, and then interpretation. And the dog has to interpret the message and then finally give us a response based on understanding what that message is telling it. And through imprinting, and, you know, I use the term imprinting. I know other people use bridging, pairing, and association, and different terms. You may be aware I wrote the book, Imprinting Your Dog in 15 Days. You know, that's the term I was raised using, and that's the term I use. So when I say imprinting, I'm talking about the introduction of odor to a dog. So as long as the dog's been imprinted on a target odor, then it interprets that odor and it gives you a response. So if we think about the communication chain then, if it's broken in any way, then the chain obviously cannot exist. And if any of these links are broken, then the message can't reach the dog. So for instance, if there's no target present, then the dog's not going to give a response. But if the odor isn't present, and there can be two reasons for this. One is obviously the environment, or its wrappings or something isn't allowing the odor to escape, or if the substance doesn't have detectable odor for a canine. We recently did a project. We were using pure cocaine, like 99% pure cocaine, and the dogs couldn't detect it, not consistently anyway, not consistently enough for the research. So we had to change the dogs to methyl benzoate. Methyl benzoate is the actual smell of cocaine, but the dogs would also find the mixing agents. But you know, some substances just don't have an odor that dogs can locate. So if there's no odor present, then the dogs are obviously not going to be able to detect anything. Then we talk about the environment, and again, it can be the threats of the environment, such as heat and cold, or the actual substance that's holding the target. If we think about olfaction, it could be that the nose is damaged, or the dog's sick and it's not working correctly. And then finally, the response, the interpretation, is understanding that target through training, but also then the response and the ability to dog to have understood what that odor is and then tell you that it's present. And if we apply this chain in training, and then, for instance, if we're doing a training scenario or even live ops and the dog has a miss, we can think that any one of these links could be missing, and therefore we need to analyze, well, which link is broken? Why didn't the dog respond? If the target's present, then either the odor wasn't available, the environment was holding the odor, the dog was sick, or the nose wasn't working correctly, or the dog didn't know the odor, or didn't know how to respond. So I use the communication chain as applied to a detection dog to actually help me solve issues if a dog misses an aid or fails to respond on an aid, because by brainstorming each of these links, I can actually analyze, well, why wasn't the dog successful? What went wrong? And recently, actually, recently. Last night, someone phoned me, a handler, with an issue, and they said that typically, you know, their dog never gives false responses, and they went to a field, worked the dog. There was a known training aid out, and the dog gave 3 false responses in the field. So I asked her, well, you know, what was it responding on? What was the false responses linked to? And he said, well, I didn't go and look. I knew where the aid was, so I just moved my dog on. They worked off leash. And I said, well, how are you going to train that issue if, for instance, that dog was responding on a dead bird every time? You know, you have to then introduce dead birds as distractors within your environment to proof the dog off it. So, you know, if you have an issue, you have to investigate it to solve it. And that's the same with a dog not finding an odor. You know, we shouldn't just shrug it off and say, oh, well, it never found the odor today. We should really analyze which part of the chain was missing and how can I solve that if it isn't a solvable issue. I mean, if it's something like the dog is sick and its nose just isn't working or something, other than, you know, potentially seeing a vet, but if it's age related or something, there's nothing you could do. But if it's a training issue or an environmental issue or something, then obviously you can work on it. So the communication chain is something that I use both in analyzing any issues in training, but also I think it's important to understand it so you can visualize the whole process of a dog actually searching and detecting something, and then the follow-on process from a target being present. So when we did work the landmine detection dog program, we needed a very high level of detection, obviously, and capability, because these are small mines that have been located then in the ground 8 years plus. So they're very much naturalized into the environment. And throughout the imprint process, I kind of developed this, what I call the principles of the 3-leg stool. And there's a good chance you use some of these principles or all of them. I've just given it a term and break it down into 3 separate parts. But I think these principles, the 3-leg stool principle in imprinting, actually is important because it sets that baseline in detection and ensures your dog has the capability to move on to training. So when I talk about the principles of the 3-leg stool, they are focused on imprinting. I do use them throughout training to one degree or another, or if I'm introducing a new odor or something, but particularly they're for imprinting to set that solid foundation in what I'm trying to achieve. So the 3-leg stool then is made up of discrimination, trace, and generalization. And I'm going to talk about each one of these individually, but the idea of it being a 3-leg stool is that if any one of these principles isn't present or isn't done effectively, then the stool will fall over. And if the stool falls over, then we're not going to be successful in our imprinting program, or certainly not to what I like to achieve. And I just want to point out at this point that, you know, what I teach and what I'm saying I've learned doesn't mean it's right and doesn't mean you have to do it this way. It's the way I do it, and it's what I've learned. So all I'm trying to do is pass on information that I've learned through my experience and my understanding. And you're obviously, you know, perfectly at liberty just to walk away and say, well, I learned nothing and I'm not going to use it. Or, you know, you could see that something and say, well, actually, I quite like that, I'm going to use it. But I never tell people, you know, it's my way and that's the only way. It's definitely not the only way. And there's a lot of trainers, even today, that I watch and think, oh, I like that. I think I'll use that in my program. But this 3-leg stool is something that we learned in the Mind Dog program. And as I said, it's something that I use today. So the first one is trace. Actually, that photograph, so that is Bellingers. They're from mussels. It's the cloud that a mussel emits for actual breeding, and they're microscopic in size. And we're just wrapping up, tomorrow is the last day, a month-long project where we're comparing the ability of detection dogs to locate Bellingers in water sources such as lakes, and these are invasive Bellingers, against eDNA, environmental DNA, which is an expensive and slow process. But the idea is that we could use dogs to analyze samples of water from lakes a lot quicker and a lot more effectively. So in this case, trace is microscopic. If you have one of these in 10 milliliters of water, it's absolutely microscopic, but the dog has to have the ability to detect that level at that trace amount. Now, if we're talking about explosives, there wouldn't be enough explosive there to blow your fingernail off. So trace is relevant to the target that you are looking for. But what I try and do is imprint on the lowest amount. And what I'm starting to do during the imprinting phase, remember this is calibrate the nose to really work hard. And I'll talk about some of the science behind that in a little bit, because we ended up doing some research into some issues I was seeing by people using too much odor, not for no fault to their own, and I can describe why, but not actually working the nose and making the nose really calibrated to detect small amounts of odor. So the trace amount is going to be dictated by the target, but you should really work on the smallest amount possible during imprinting to get the whole process of detection rolling. The next one is generalization, and this is whereby we expose the dog to as many different samples of the same product as possible. So in this case, I'm using the example TNT because this is where the use of TNT is where I learned this lesson. So we train the dogs on Yugoslavian TNT because that's what the landmines were made of in Bosnia. And it's a particular type of TNT made in one factory. Dogs were finding 0.0025 of a gram of this stuff consistently. They're also finding actual landmines in the ground, no problems at all. So, we were quite happy that the dogs could find TNT. Well, as I said, I was training United States, it was actually engineers, Army Corps of Engineers, soldiers in landmine detection while I was in the British Army. And we shipped some of the dogs over here to the States. And I came over to run part of the training program after we'd started the training in the UK. I'd brought the dogs over with the handlers to finish the training up in the United States. And we got some American TNT, and we were just doing the imprint, the basic calibration imprint phase, if you want to call it that, but a calibration phase. And the dogs walked the TNT. And I couldn't believe it. I'm thinking these dogs are finding 0.0025 of a gram all the way up to landmines. No problem whatsoever. We put TNT out and they can't find it. So we did a quick imprint session, and then the dogs within a day were actually finding that TNT as effectively as they did others. So we've got another type of TNT, a third type, exactly the same issue, but not as bad, but it was a very similar issue. And I discussed this with someone who was an expert in odor and odor in canines, but it was then termed generalization. And what he told me was, you made them what he terms the expert nose. You made the dogs absolutely perfect at finding Yugoslavian TNT to the point they ignored all of the variants of TNT. And that I've encountered that since that day with different things. If you, like I do a lot of conservation work. So if you train a dog on scat from a captive bred lizard, the dog will become an expert at finding scat. And sorry, scat is poop. The dogs will become an expert at finding scat from a captive bred lizard, unless you expose the dogs to as many different variations of that lizard scat as possible. So you find it in the wild, you get it from different zoos, you even get it from different locations within the country. Because there's a lot of things, for instance, in lizard scat that determine its odor. And it can be the environment, it can be its food, it's the age of the animal, etc., or the reptile. And TNT would be the same. It's the factory, it's the environmental smells, it's the actual products it's made of, it's the packaging, it's the way it's transported, it's the way it's stored. Any target you train the dog on, human remains or anything, you can make the dog an absolute expert on that particular sample you have. So you need to generalize as much as possible. As just a pencil on the paper mark, I say at least 3. I mean, it could be a lot more. You need to generalize as many variants as you can get But unless a target, a source of odor, has only one type, for instance, if there's a particular lizard that only lives in one part of the, like I just finished a project on Wyoming toads. They only live in one county in the world, and we only search like 3 or 4 particular lakes. They're so scarce that you can train the dog on one toad and it's going to find the others because that is the only smell. I mean, they don't really change from toad to toad, but if they were lizards that were all over the country, then I would have to change it. So whatever your source is, you need to generalize across as many different samples as possible. And the final one I talk about is discrimination. And this isn't just the ability of a dog to tell, okay, that's my target, and next to it is coffee, and next to that is rubber bands, which, you know, that's part of an odor recognition test. Very typical. You have distraction odors within jars or paint cans or whatever your setup is. But what I do is mix the target with other items. So I always mix the target with my distractors. So if I'm using sand or soil or vegetation or coffee or whatever it is, I put the target in with those distractors. So the dog has to discriminate, okay, there's coffee and it's just coffee. Or it might be, that is coffee, but it's got hazelnut coffee, etc. Oh, there's coffee and it has my target in it. So I have to respond. And I think this discrimination during imprinting actually teaches the dog to understand that your target, your source of odor, can exist with all this noise, with other smells. And you have to tell me within all these other smells, which one contains your target. And I do that with, you know, all my dogs as we move through training, because actually in real life, and if you just look there, that's actually some, at the bottom-ish left on that log, there's a little black patch. That's oil that was under the snow, and I've cleared the snow away after the dog responded, just to check where she'd responded. But, you know, if you look at that photograph, how many other odors are in that photograph? You can see the oil is actually on a branch. It was under snow. There's grass, there's water. There's no doubt insects and vegetation and different odors all around the place. And the dog has to actually pick that target out from all those other smells and say, well, here it is. So this photograph, it never went above 10 Celsius for the whole week. You can see the snow on the ground. It was freezing cold. It's actually on a river. And the target had been under snow and she still managed to find it, and several other finds as well. And I think part of that is because I do emphasize this discrimination phase during imprinting. So one of the other lessons I learned was about containers and the use of containers, which, you know, we do use containers, whether they're barriers to actually protect the environment from contamination, it's still some sort of container, or we actually put our products inside a container to protect them from the dog and the environment, or just because they can't be stored any other way. So again, oil, you know, it can't be just left in the open. So I have to put it in some sort of container to stop it rolling away. So we use containers, but what happened was when we started the landmine detection program, we were supplied these, there were paper discs that they use in chemistry labs in Petrodiscs, so like a blotting paper. About the white blotting paper, you see, what, 3 or 4 inches in diameter. And what they did was they melted about 0.025 of a gram of TNT onto these discs. And we used these discs during imprinting. So this was a rack system. It had like 80 containers. The dogs had to walk along these tubes and tell us which one had TNT. Again, it was mixed with grass, etc., but it still had to find which one was TNT. And we was achieving 100% on this odor recognition test, not a problem at all. So then I took these same discs of paper out and I'd put them in slits in the ground. So there was discs with the TNT melted on them. And then I put blank discs out as well. No problem, the dog worked. It didn't respond on the blank paper discs, but it did respond on those with small amounts of TNT in. Great, training's going really well. So then the next stage was just to have TNT on the ground. And again, the TNT was put in, plain TNT was put in these little slits, worked the dogs, and they walked it. And this was 6 dogs. It wasn't just one. So this was all the dogs walking it. So you go through the communication chain, and we brainstormed and went through it. And what I realized was, after it took several days of actually trying different things, but what I realized was we trained the dogs to find the paper discs first. That became their primary scent for finding the target because it smelled, it's nice and easy to find. Then once the dog had found the paper, it discriminated which paper contained the target and which paper didn't. So it had learned, okay, there's the paper. That was nice and easy to find. Does it contain TNT? No. All right, I'll move on. There's the paper. Does it contain TNT? Yes, I'll respond. But when it's TNT on its own, it's not looking for that. It was looking for the paper first. So you have to be very careful that your containers don't become the primary target odor. And I see this sometimes where, people use these containers and the container's smell is bigger than the actual target that they're using. And therefore the container can become the primary odor the dog uses. And you go and put the container out in a field and the dog has no problems finding the target, but you're kind of just convincing yourself, because the way to check is to actually put your target out with no container and make sure the dog's actually locating the target. So there's a consideration to think about. Again, a lesson learned, but one, I never make a mistake again. If I have the option, I don't use containers at all. But if not, then the containers are used as controls, but also as much as possible, I change the containers. So there is no associated odor that's consistent. But I also want to check as soon as possible by putting just target out that the dog is not using containers to then bring it into a target. Quantities is something we need to think about. And this is two parts to this, and I'll talk about the other study and why it came about in a moment. And I'm going to have to talk kind of not parrot fashion, but I wasn't involved in this research. The team up at Texas Tech University, Dr. Nathan Horn and his team, they were involved in this research. And what happened was, and forgive me if I don't get the story exactly right, a police canine had been called out to an actual search. There was a hold all. He worked his dog on the hold all, and the dog never responded. And from my understanding, a second dog worked on the hold all. Both dogs were certified in the target odor and had done very well in the training records. But then the hold all was lifted and opened, and it was found to be full of the actual target. And I can't remember whether it was TNT or C4 or something. So the question was asked, why did the 2 trained dogs give 0 response on this backpack, which had a lot of target in, when they did great in training? And what this research demonstrated was that they replicated the research and they used other dogs. And what it demonstrated was that if you train the dogs on a small amount of target, then your dogs don't necessarily respond on a large amount. And you'll have to read the exact paper and the links there. But it goes into, we calibrate the nose firstly to a certain amount, and the dog then becomes accustomed to finding the odor at a certain level. But also, as target size increases or decreases, it can change. And those that have listened to Dr. Nathan Hall and some of his podcasts, obviously he explains it really well about, there's certain plants that for perfume that in a small amount smell very flowery and very nice, but then in a large amount, they smell like poop. And it's the same molecule, but it's the quantity that changes the actual odor, the fragrance of the odor. So, we have to consider that small amounts do not necessarily smell the same as large amounts, and potentially you're training the dog to ignore different size amounts of your target if you don't vary the amount. Now, it could be the case that your target is a set amount. And again, if we go back to the scat of lizards, it's never more than, it goes from the ones I look for, it goes from a grain of rice to like an inch in size. So there's not too much variance there. And I just train the dogs on all those different amounts. I don't need to train on a pound of scat because you would never, ever find that in real life. It's not going to happen. So the dog's nose can be calibrated within the region of what they're going to actually find. So whatever your target is, consider that. But you want to ensure that you train and expose the dogs to the full range of target that you're actually looking for. So following on from that slightly is this stimulus control of odorant concentration. And this was a research project that I was involved with, but only it was my hypothesis. And then I went to Dr. Nathan Hall and discussed it with him, and we got some funding. And Dr. now, Mallory DeChant, actually did the work. But this was based off some of the restrictions that I was encountering as an instructor for the military, where at one of the schools, they would only allow you to train on the amount of explosive that came from the manufacturer. You was never allowed to cut it down to any other size. So for instance, a block of C4 came in 1¼ pounds. It was never allowed to be taken out of its wrapping, and it always had to be used in 1¼ pounds. TNT came in its amount from the manufacturer, etc. But so we spent like 12, 15 weeks training these dogs on these odors at the school. And then we went away for up to a month of environmental training in the desert. And initially the dogs would walk large targets of the same odor or small amounts, because we was allowed to dig it, allowed to cut it down in the desert environment phase because we had EOD supporting us. And I kind of came up with this idea, well, if you always train a dog on 1¼ pound, then that's what the dog's always going to find. Well, when I went up to Canada, and it was that search that was in the very first photo I showed you, one of the issues was, and we'll talk about finds in a minute, was the dogs were finding everything on that riverbank related to target, even minute trace amounts of oil, all the way up to those huge mats. But the problem was the environmentalists didn't need to find those tiny amounts of oil. They're not actionable in that the environment will actually break them down. Bacteria, etc., and the weather will break down that oil. What you need to find is the big mats and the big lumps, etc., that's going to cause an issue both to the environment and to wildlife. And the question was asked, well, why can't you train the dog to only find set amounts, a certain amount of target, and ignore anything lower than a certain amount? And my hypothesis was, well, you can, because I've seen that with C4, for instance, when we train the dog on 1¼ pound, that's what it would find. And it wouldn't find the higher and it wouldn't find the lower until we actually trained it to do it. And basically this research demonstrated that you can actually train a dog to ignore smaller or larger amounts of an odor if you've imprinted it at a certain level. And it's about tenfold. So it will naturally ignore a tenfold amount lower than it's been imprinted on or above. Which great for our clients in oil response, because it means the principle exists. We can, in principle, calibrate a dog to only find a certain range of oil or anything above a certain level, which is exactly what they want. But what the research also demonstrated was that dogs will naturally ignore lower amounts of oil or target, or we can actually train them to ignore lower amounts of the same target. And in this case, in this research, what we did was, or what Dr. DeChant did was reinforce the dogs for ignoring small amounts, and then only reinforce the dog when it found the actual target amount. And that meant the dogs learned, okay, I have to ignore this small amount to get my reward, but if I respond on what I'm being presented as the right amount, I will get my reward. So the consequence of this is if your cross-contamination protocols are not so good, if your areas are contaminated, and for instance, if your dog shows a false response or goes to investigate an area that has trace amounts or small amounts of target and you move it on, etc., and then you reward it for finding its actual training target, what we're doing is we're training the dog to ignore small amounts of odor or low odor levels and telling it only to find a certain level. And this, the consequence of this can be when you get into the field, if the dog's out searching for something and it's well hidden and it smells a level of odor, it might say, oh, okay, I don't have to respond on this because it's lower than I get rewarded for. So I need to keep going and find the one that I actually need to find. So this was an important consequence, I think, because we have to understand that contamination of our training areas and cross-contamination skills are critically important. Wearing gloves, and I've heard the argument several times of, well, terrorists don't wear gloves when they're handling explosives, which maybe that's true. I'm not going to say it's not true, but terrorists only attempt to use explosive once. Generally, with training aids, they're what we've got, and we have to use them for several times or over the course of several months. So really, we need to look after them, both from contaminating those targets with, for instance, human odor, but also contaminating the environment through touching that target and then touching the environment with our hands, which are contaminated. The containers we use, obviously how we store the explosives, etc., they all have a consequence on contaminating our training areas. And I go to great pains to ensure I don't contaminate my training areas for the very reason that this research demonstrates we can actually calibrate our dogs to ignore certain levels of its trained odor. And I think that's a very important lesson. One thing I do see people do is they put gloves on, which is great, but then they'll stand with those gloves in their pockets and they'll drink a cup of coffee, then they'll pick up the target, and then they'll put the target out, and then they'll go and open the door by using the door handle, then they'll take the gloves off. There's no point putting gloves on if you're going to use them in that way. It's put the gloves on, touch the product, put the product out, take the gloves off immediately, etc. And actually, it was one of the consequences of COVID, hopefully, that it's taught us how to use gloves effectively because of that. So I'm going to touch on rewarding. And this is a topic that I know there's a lot of conversations online about. And I'll just tell you how I do it. Again, I'm not saying this is right or anything, or this is the only way. It's definitely not, but this is just how I do it. And I do it this way because of some of the lessons I've learned, both from landmine detection, but also oil detection. First of all, the table in front of you, that was the 1 year I was up in Canada, and I'm going to show you some little video in a minute. That is the river in Canada that I was working with my dog. And this is some fines of 4 different dogs. The blue is where I've blocked out the dogs' names. So you can see, there was 8,689 fines in that one period. And it was 4 months. We were working 6 days a week for 4 months. Or 2 of the dogs were, those that had 3,000 fines. The other 2 at the 800s, they left a little earlier. But, I was there for the course of the 4 months. So a lot of fines, 7,748 were verified. That means that the environmentalist that was with us could actually find what the dog had responded on. Now, look at that environment. If you're looking for a pea size or even smaller amount of oil, which the dogs were finding, it's very difficult for the human to locate exactly what the dog had found, especially if it's in the mud or in the sediment, etc. And again, I'll talk about that in a minute. So the detection rate was really high. We had a lot of fines. On one day, I had 183 positive target locations with my dog. That's a lot. If you think about drugs and explosives, etc., that would be a very bad day if you're finding 183 IEDs, explosive devices, on a search. So, the lessons learned from that are that you can't effectively reward a dog with a Kong 183 times in a day when your dog does on average 20 miles in those types of environments. And we worked all the way through. It started in the spring, which was still snow and cold, all the way through hot, humid summer, back into snow, as you saw in the photo earlier. So some of those days were very oppressive and hot and humid, etc. And the dog had to work all day. So reward selection is something that I do with my dogs. This is an exercise, and there's a free webinar on my webpage actually about this, where I allow the dogs to choose its favorite rewards. And then I have this hierarchy of rewards, which the dog has chosen and told me it enjoys. So I don't just pick, okay, you're having a Kong and that's your toy. I have the dog to tell me which is its favorite toy. Is it a tennis ball? Is it a Kong? Is it a chucker ball? Is it a tug toy? Does it like the tug over the retrieve, etc.? Variable rewards, and again, I'm not using the correct terminology, if you like, from psychology, and I apologize for that. It's just the term I use. So variable rewards and partial reward, these are names that I give a system I use where I'll reward the dogs with treats and I'll reward the dogs with toys, but it might get cheese, it might get bologna, it might get hot dog, it might get praise, just physical praise or verbal praise or both, or it might get a Kong. I have all these different rewards I use, and by doing that, what I can do is extend the duration of the day through searching, because the dog doesn't get tired or because it's retrieving its Kong 183 times. If it's had a piece of cheese, and I'm talking little tiny cubes of cheese or piece of hot dog or something, for 10 of those finds, and then it gets its ball for one of the finds, and then for another 7, it gets a piece of cheese, etc. I'm not tiring the dog out. I'm not satisfying its desire for its final reinforcement for its jackpot, which I save for really good searches or as I start to see it lagging during the search, etc. So it gives me the ability to actually work the dog all day and not have any issues. And I use clickers, I use food now, I use different toys because of that, because I learn, and it came again from the Mind Dog program, because you can't reward a dog in a minefield. If the dog responds in a minefield, there's no way you can throw a tennis ball in, or you can, but only once. It's going to function the mine and you're done. So what you have to do then is come up with a variable reward system, or partial reward as I term it. And this comes back to, we were concerned that the dog would find a landmine and then it would give a response. And we had to find 3 landmines before we was allowed to extract ourselves from the minefield. And my concern was, all right, it's found a landmine, but it doesn't get its ball. And then we work it on and it's actually going to ignore the next landmine. I mean, I was pretty naive back then. And I discussed this with a trainer friend and he said, no, it doesn't work like that. When the dog finds the first landmine, just praise it. And then when it finds the second, just praise it. And when it finds the third, withdraw and give it its ball. Mark it, tell it it's right, but withdraw from the minefield and give its ball. So in training, we tried this. On the first landmine, we didn't give the dog its ball. We praised it and then told it to work on. And I actually saw, and I could hear the dogs working harder. They really started to work hard. They really started to use their nose. And then the second landmine, we did the same, and it was the same. They really started to work hard. And what I realized was the dogs were still getting a reward, but they wasn't getting the reward they wanted. What they wanted was the jackpot. So maybe they were thinking, oh, I didn't quite sit fast enough, or I didn't quite sit soon enough, or maybe, I didn't do something right that gave me my jackpot. I better work harder. And I've continued with that process because of that. And then when we have to go through duration of long searches like this, throughout the course of a day, 20 miles, etc., this partial reward system or variable rewards actually increases duration and makes the dog work harder, not work less. And then the final thing, which I know again is a hot topic in the minute on a number of Facebook feeds I see is, do you reward live finds? I do, but it's personal choice and it depends on the situation. So I say I do, however, there are caveats to that. I'm not going to reward a dog on a live find for an explosive device, not at source anyway. Now I'm going to recall the dog because that's what I do. I always work an explosive dog off leash unless there's a real safety issue that I can't, which would be a low risk search of a vehicle. I can't think, particularly if it's a high risk search, I would never work a dog on lead. But if the dog's responded, then I do a recall. But I'll still reward it when it gets back to me. Now I might give it a reward of praise, etc., because I want to get out the area quick. But on conservation, on environmental work, etc., I always reward. And I'm going to show a little video when I do my slide correctly. I'm going to show this video. Now, this is me just walking along behind my dog. As I said, this is up in Canada. This is a real live search. So it's me filming, which is why it's a little jerky at times. This is all one day that you're going to see my dog working. And she has a number of finds. First of all, we'll talk about the response, etc., in a bit. But so she responds on a target. And again, I'm going to vary it. I don't always do the same thing when she responds on a target. So there's a target there. I've not seen it at this point, and I just throw in this case, okay, it's the orange Kong. In this instance, again, there's another target ahead of us. She moves forward. She starts to show a change in behavior. She's investigating a source. She gives me a response. And then from this distance, I'm happy. You've got to find there's a chucker ball, one of those plastic harder chucker ball, or chugger ball is it called? This one is a tennis ball, but I'm at source and I've placed a flag out already. So constantly I'm changing what I do in the field. I don't generally take a clicker in the field with me. It's just too much. It's another thing around my neck because I use whistles to work my dog. I have to wear life vests in these type of environments. I have a fluorescent vest on with lots of pockets because we have to data collect, and I'm carrying all this gear. I'm carrying rewards. So generally I don't bother with a clicker in the field. But I do vary where and how I reward my dog, whether it's at source, whether I do a recall, whether it's at distance, whether I give food, ball, what retrieve reward it is, etc. All right, so this video, and I said I'll talk about response in the field. This is the same dog. And in this instance, there is actually target sub-sediment in that water there, or in that sediment underwater. And this was one of the first times she'd ever encountered this. She'd never encountered it before. I mean, typically we find the oil up on branches, as you saw on the riverbank, etc., but it mixed with the sediment and is actually underwater. So in this case, she's not giving me that trained response. She's not going into a sit. I mean, there's enough changing behavior and sniffing behavior there for me to think there's something going on. And then she looks at me. That's enough. I'm going to call that and say, okay, I'm happy. There's something here. And then a lot of times, until the dog gains experience, and even when it is experienced, it might not give you the final response in the field. It might just give you a change in behavior. And there's another video in a moment of the same dog in water doing that. And I'll still call that, and there's no problem with that in you saying, look, I'm not happy with the behavior my dog's shown me. I think you need to check this area out. Now, obviously, I'm not going to just walk along doing that all the time just to, cover my bases. But if the dog shows me a change in behavior, I'm going to say, hey, there's something going on here. Now, what I did find as well, where we had these protracted days of a lot of distance, the dog is getting tired and has a lot of fines, it actually wouldn't go into a final response. It would do this type of behavior. It's just tired. It's, it's ready. It's the end of the day. There's target here, but I'm not going to give a sit, whether it's because it's in mud and water or because I'm just tired. But it shows me, that's an indication, it's shown me enough. There's something there. So we need to always be aware of changes of behavior in our dogs and then analyze what are they telling us. And this next video here kind of illustrates that. So again, this is a first find actually underwater. She's showing me a sniffing behavior, going in circles, that bang, changing behavior, following a source. With oil dogs and with cadaver dogs, we see this little lapping of the water. It's believed that actually the Jacobson organ, they're using that to actually taste the odor as well, to kind of confirm that there's odor present. And this whole change of behavior that I'm seeing is enough to me to say to the environmentalist, I'm not happy, there's something out there. And actually they went out and they used their shovels, they turned up the sediment and an oil sheen came to the surface. So the oil was under the water there in the mud, not something we trained the dogs to find, but she did. So again, you don't always get that nice trained response. You get changes behavior, it makes the hairs on your back of your neck stand up, and you just report it and tell people to investigate it. All right, so transferring to real then. So, there's other trainers that say this. I didn't caption the saying, but training is not real. As much as you simulate as much as possible, you can never simulate real life, or very rarely, should I say, simulate real life and what you're going to encounter in the field. And you need to, as much as possible, transfer the dog from training to real life. One of the best ways to do that is double blind searches. Again, hot topic on the internet, I know, but I do double blind searches. That really hones you as a handler. If you don't know double blind is where you don't know and your assistant doesn't know where the targets are. So that your assistant, and we see it a lot, the person following you suddenly goes quiet when your dog's getting near odor, or suddenly stands still, or suddenly moves to the right so they can get a better view. And actually the dogs can pick up on these little cues and actually use them to locate odor. So double blind is where neither of you know. You go out on a search, and obviously the dog doesn't know, and you're just working your dog, and I think this is a great step for you to really read your dog and understand your dog, because if you know where your target is all the time, you're going to use it consciously or subconsciously. So do double blinds as much as possible. Blank searches are very important. And I'll do 20 to 50% blank searches where there's nothing there for the dog to find, because the dog has to understand and not have the expectation every time I go out, I'm going to find something. Because if it does and it doesn't find anything, then you open yourself up to frustration of the dog and stress, but also false responses. And we had something at one of the training schools I worked with. I termed it the 20-minute sit. The dogs, because of the amount of students and the amount of time the students had with an instructor with their dog, you could only get about a 20-minute practical search session in per student per dog. And some of them had a couple of dogs. So around the 20-minute mark, if the dog hadn't found anything, it would start to give false responses, because it learned, all right, around this time, there's going to be target. I haven't found anything yet. I'm going to start saying there's something here, because, there's going to be something here. And it did exist. So by having blank searches, blanks being there's nothing out, or there's just controls, that is containers or something, or the rubber gloves, the disposable gloves you use, put them out as distractors, but no target. Then the dogs learn, okay, sometimes there's no target out and sometimes there is. But I don't have an expectation every search I'm going to find a target. And if the only time your dog doesn't find target is when it goes out and real operational searches, then really, are we setting our dogs up for success if that's the only times it finds something? And the dogs learn the difference between training and real. And they learn, okay, we're going out for a real search, I never find anything. And we're going out for training, I always find something. So we have to be very careful about how we start to transfer to real. What I also try and do is expose my dog to 3 real finds and give it a high value reward when it finds them. And I say there in brackets, parentheses, whatever you want to call them, even if it's set up. So by that, I mean, let's say, for instance, your dog has shown a change in behavior. you report the area, and then the assistant says, oh yeah, I see it, it's right there. And if it's safe to do so, like if it's a piece of scat or something, send the dog back to it, and then mark and reward, or reward at source before it's responded. Do something to tell it that is the target, you were right. Or if an assistant or someone, one of the other search teams finds a target, then tell them, you know, for my first ever search, if you find a target, tell me. I'm going to bring my dog up and I'm going to let it work on it. Whatever you need to do, if it's safe to do so, give your dog exposure to real targets, reward them, even if it's before they've responded, but as they're smelling that target, and give them a high value reward. And that starts to help to transfer them from training to real life. Again, I use the figure 3. There's nothing to back that up. There's no science or anything. It's just my experience. Generally, if I do this 3 times on target, the dog then understands, okay, now I know what I'm supposed to be doing. And it starts to throw its trained response out and actually transfers to real. I'm going to briefly go over buried odor. I know we're at an hour already, and I want to leave time for questions if I can. So I'm going to go over buried odor. Oh, so I've just noticed I spell odor in English and some of it in American. Obviously, I'm English and I live in America, so I kind of mix and match my grammar. So if anyone picks up, oh, you spelled odor wrong, you didn't put a U in it, that's why. So I'm going to go over buried odor and some of the things I learned, because I also learned some of the mistakes, if I can call them that people make when they think they're working on buried odor. So molecules of subsurface targets can get to the surface in 4 ways, or actually they're affected by the subsurface environment in 4 ways. Typically you don't see venting, and this is just a term I gave it because I don't know if it's considered, but we have venting when we bury things, even landmines. And this is where, in this case, if you look, it's coarse sand. This is where the target odor molecules can actually bounce around, and they find ways through the soil or sand or whatever is to the surface. And then they vent off. I mean, that's just the term I called it, venting. We find this a lot with oil, because oil is very small molecules. They're very volatile, and they bounce all over the place, and they can dig their way even through clay, etc., to the surface. And we actually did a research trial in February 2020, and the results hopefully are being released soon, where the dogs were able to detect oil, about a liter of oil, 15 feet below the surface. And it was like a 99.7% detection rate. One of the dogs failed to locate or didn't respond on one of the locations, but otherwise, you know, all the dogs found everything. And we used a device, a PID, which can actually detect oil, and at 1 inch directly above the target, it could locate at maximum 0.6 parts per million. And even some of them, it couldn't locate at all. If it was more than 1 inch away, it couldn't locate the source. But the dogs were finding some of the sources from over 30 feet away and then following the plume to source. So that was all venting. Typically, a buried target molecule will get to the surface through the action of moisture, and I'll go through that in a minute. The molecules from a buried target will actually attach themselves to the soil structure or the sand or whatever it is. And also they'll sit in air pockets. And again, I'll describe this in a bit more detail. So first of all, with venting, the actual molecules themselves bounce around, find little channels and get up to the surface. And then they're given off through the surface, you know, and they're very readily, or they're pretty readily able to find by the dog, because they represent the headspace that typically it's trained at, although it's going to be a lot smaller amount. Now, this is the volatiles, not the heavier molecules, which are held in the ground. So this is actually a representation of what happens to molecules in the ground. And this isn't a graphic of mine. I took this from a landmine training video. Top right, that represents the molecules being held in air pockets. And those molecules just sit there bouncing around the air pockets. They can't escape. They can't move themselves through the oil, through the ground, through the soil. unless something else acts on them, either moisture or being dug out the ground or something, they're there. I mean, they're trapped. They're doing nothing. Then bottom right is the molecules attached to the soil or the sand or whatever it is. They're attached. They're susceptible to biodegradation, so bacteria will eat them or whatever. They can actually be transported through the soil if they're picked up by moisture, but basically they're attached to the soil structure and just sit there again until something else acts on them. And then the bottom left, that is the molecules that are diluted or being transported within the moisture content. And those are really the molecules, except for venting, those are the molecules your dogs are going to find. So the molecules are there sitting in the soil. They're waiting for a moisture event, and it could be rain or it could be dew or something moving down through the soil. This then picks up the molecules, either through the molecules diluting into the water or the particles being moved through the force of water, and then they get to the surface and they form what I call is a footprint. So some of the molecules are actually held at the surface there in this footprint of odor. Some break away through the actions of the environment. So the sun, for instance, might break them away from the soil or destroy them because of UV light. They could evaporate with the water, both diluted, or the water might pick them up as it evaporates and moves into the environment. Now with TNT, what has been proven is from landmines, as soon as they break that boundary layer of about 1 inch from the surface, they're gone. You know, you cannot find them. Your dog really has to find those molecules held within the footprint or right above it. And for that reason, I spend a lot of time training my dogs on how to find subsurface odors, because a lot of what I'm looking for is subsurface, whether that's landmines or oil, or even if that was a buried lizard or something under the surface. Because one, if you only train on the headspace that's carried on plumes, the scent cone or scent pool, then that's what the dog's expecting to find, and that's what it's looking for. But in this case, the molecules are held at the surface in a footprint. One, those molecules are not the same necessarily that it's looking for on a typical target, but also it's not in the same environment that it's used to finding it. In this case, it's actually in the ground structure, not in a plume of air or in a scent pool. So we have to model that behavior. We have to train the dog to actually hunt the ground and find the target within its ground. And we also have to train the dog to understand those molecules might be slightly different. What you might be looking for is the molecules dilute with the moisture, etc. So I'm going to quickly show a video. This is an experiment I did in a fish tank. It's full of sand. There is a sheet of perspex between the two sides of the tank where that ruler is. I then filled it with sand. There's oil in the bottom. And as you can see, I put some perspex on the top. Although it's vented to the air and temperature, it stops water getting into one side of the tank and not into the other. And what I was wanting to see is, how does that rain, that water, actually soaking into the ground and then moving up as the sun dried it off? And this was in Texas, so we get heavy storms and then a lot of high temperature sunny days. How does that affect the movement of that oil through the substructure? And it doesn't have to be oil. This is just a good target for me to use, and it's cheap and easy. It could be any subsurface type of target. It could be HR, it could be explosives, could be anything. And what we start to see over time, and this was over a considerable amount of weeks, is that the odor starts to separate, and we get the heavy molecules, the black you can see there on the bottom of the tank. Then there's a band of what we visualize as nothing. Then there's another band of odor moving up towards the surface. And what happened was the actual odors separated. The heavy molecules sank and the lighter molecules were able to move themselves to the surface. And I haven't got a plan that is a top picture of the actual sand, but in the end, there was a footprint, a visible footprint on the right-hand side of oil and nothing on the left-hand side. So one of the things we also came across was that dogs would respond on landmines that were, and there was plants growing above them. And what I thought was, well, potentially that the molecules we know are being diluted in the moisture content, and the plant through the roots are sucking up those molecules, and then the moisture is evaporated from the leaves. And we know that happens, you know, is part of chemistry, that plants suck up moisture and then they evaporate from their leaves. But the dogs would actually respond on the plant and not on the ground below it. So I was thinking, okay, that makes sense to me. But I spoke to a scientist and he said, that's impossible. There's no way that molecules could be in the moisture, sucked up, and then evaporate from the leaves. And what he said was, more than likely is that the footprint forms on the surface. As the moisture evaporates, the molecules move up with the moisture, and then they're actually attaching themselves to the leaves on the underside of the leaves where it's moist and it's sticky, and they're shaded from the sun and they're protected, and the dog's located those pools of oil from underneath. And another scientist told me, no, it's perfectly feasible. They're sucking up the moisture and the plant is actually giving off the smell. I don't know which is correct, and we've never researched it. All I know is if a dog responds on a plant, then I'm going to consider there's something below the ground, and the plant has the freshest soil, freshest odor that the dog is able to detect, and therefore that's what it responds on. But it is a phenomenon, and what we actually did was we dug up some of these plants when the dogs had responded on them and there was a target underneath, moved them to another field, buried them, and then worked the dogs and they responded on the plants again. Now, it could be a process of obviously moving them, etc. But, you know, I'm pretty confident that the dogs were responding on some sort of target molecules within those plants. So talking about, obviously, and this is, I think, the last slide, but talking about buried odor then, what I do see a lot of times is people will bury a target in a field and then they will bury dummy holes. They'll just dig holes, cause disturbance, and then work the dog, you know, an hour later or 2 hours later and say, well, my dog can find buried odor. And what I'm trying to explain to them is they can't, not naturalize buried odor. I mean, it's fine if you're looking for a target that actually only exists in the ground for less than 8 hours under a freshly dug hole, then fine. Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. But if you're looking for a target that's naturalized within the environment over days, weeks, months, then no, that's not necessarily what you're actually training the dog to do. And if we look at this graph, and it's just something I made up to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So the bottom line is units of time, and this could be hours, days, weeks, months. It doesn't represent any specific unit of time. It's just saying there's a unit of time across the bottom, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then the left hand, the upright of the graph is actually percentage of odor. So the red line is the target. And when we bury a target, so we're looking at time 0, there is no target molecules on the surface. And if you think about digging a hole, putting your target in the bottom of the hole, then cover it in with soil, the immediate moment you bury it, there's zero target being able to move all the way through those 6, 8, 12 inches, whatever you bury your target at, to the surface. Now, sure, venting might happen fairly quick, but at the immediate moment, it's 0. There is no target there. But over time, the target eventually reaches the surface, and I described how and why it reaches the surface, and it gets to a point where it's a maximum amount of target at surface. You know, there's not going to be any more target reach the surface. That's it. It's a 100% saturation of its ability to get to the surface. So then over time, it reaches 100%. Now, the blue line is the disturbance you cause, and it's breaking the soil surface. It's turning the soil over. It's all the gases that have been trapped underneath from rotting vegetation and animal insects, and everything else that you cause when you dig a hole. That smell is at 100% when you dig that hole. But over time, as it naturalizes and seeds start to sow themselves and rain then comes down and settles the environment, that actual disturbance smell will move to zero. And again, that time is arbitrary. It could be any amount of time depending on the soil structure, the depth, the weather conditions, etc. But we have this point in the middle where it's kind of balances out, and then the amount of odor smells more than the amount of disturbance you've caused. Now, what I did notice on a project that I was involved in was that they would dig these dummy digs and then put the target in one of the holes, and the dogs would go out. And what we ended up doing was seeing the dogs would actually look for holes first, disturbance. Thinking back to those pieces of blotting paper, they were using the disturbance to key them into a location. Then they would discriminate, well, does this disturbance contain my target or not? No? All right, I'll move on to the next one. And what we actually saw was that dogs, or what I observed was that dogs that were typically very passive would actually paw at the hole and then respond. And what I believe they were doing was actually confirming, yeah, there is target there. And it gives a little paw just to open up some of the venting or get near a source and says, yep, absolutely, there's my target. I'm going to respond. And that's kind of how I came up with this hypothesis that, if you're going to bury an odor and your target naturalizes in the environment, you have to bury it for a long period of time and let it naturalize. Otherwise, you're training the dog to discriminate disturbance. And then potentially it's going to give a little paw or something to try and get the fresh target, but you're not actually training it on the target you're looking for. So again, I'm not saying I'm right or wrong. I don't know there's ever been science to prove this specifically. It's through observation of the landmine program. And then what I saw on an explosive detection dog program where passive dogs would go active, and I would see them hunt for the actual disturbance. You would see a change in behavior. They would follow the plume to the disturbance. They would check the site and then move on again. Again, they were off-leash detection dogs. All right, so this is the final slide. Just some random thoughts to finish off with before we can open up some questions. So first of all, if you are always achieving 100% success in your training, then you need to adjust your training, or that's my theory anyway. I have an 80% rule. So I really want to advance my dogs. If you're achieving 100%, you're maintaining the dog at the level that it's capable of working on, which may be fine. That may be a true representation of your operational deployments, and that's absolutely fine. But what I want to try and do through maintenance training, and I say, there's 3 reasons I do maintenance training. It's one, to meet the standard that I expect. And I'm not talking about certification standard. I'm talking about the standard I expect for in the field. To maintain the standard that my dogs met, and then I want to enhance the standard. And I always want to train harder than I'm actually deploying into. I want to make the dog work harder. I want to find harder finds, etc., than it's going to find in real life as much as possible. So I have an 80% rule. I want to try and make sure that my dog is challenged on at least 20% of my searches, that it's going to learn something, and that even if it's hard work to actually locate the source and really find it, it's learned something from that training. And that could be by burying it deeper. It could be by leaving it naturalized a week longer than I normally did. There's lots of ways to actually challenge the dog and then it learns something. It could be the amount of distractors. It could be the environment that I'm putting it into, like a field full of cattle. But I really want to challenge. And that 80% rule is generally what I try and stick to. If I'm achieving 100% in something, I'm going to ask questions as to why. Either my training isn't hard enough, or I'm making it too easy, or something that, the dog is finding it very easy. I question everything. So, 18 months ago, and I've been doing this quite a few decades. I still make mistakes. So about 18 months ago, I was working my dog on oil, and oil is a very easy odor for dogs to find. So I have to put an eyedropper amount of oil, mix it with sand, and then I put it in the fridge. And the reason I put it in the fridge is to try and reduce the amount of odor being given off by slowing down those molecules. And this is when I'm working inside the lab on, say, a carousel or something, and I'm doing discrimination training. So I only had at the time a small fridge. So I had limited space, and I was storing all my oil samples in mason jars within the fridge. And then my distractors were just being stored on a shelf in the storeroom. And then I was putting out my training aids, obviously working the dog. It's missing all the hot dogs and the coffee and feathers or whatever else I put out, and finding the target 100% of the time, no problem. Well, then one day I had some target, which I think it was fresh meat or something that I didn't want to start to go off putrid. I wanted it fresh, so it was fairly appetizing to the dog. And I put it in the fridge overnight to store it, and the next day put it in the carousel, work my dog, and it hit that distractor, that fresh meat, and it locked in. I mean, it was this dog here, actually, Poppy. It locked in, and she was convinced that is my target. That's my target. That's my target. And she knows, one, I teach my dogs the all clear, but also they know if I don't mark it, in the set amount of time, then it's an extinction exercise to move on, because that's not your target. And I'll use that when I introduce new distractors, for instance, and it might be something close to the target she's looking for. Well, she wouldn't. She was convinced this is the target. So I brought a second dog in. My other oil detection dog did exactly the same thing, locked in and was convinced that's the target. So then I went through that communication chain. Well, what is it? Why are they responding on this target? And I worked it out, and I said, okay, I know they'll ignore fresh meat. I know they can find the target in the mason jar, etc. So what if it's the fridge? And I put an empty mason jar in the fridge overnight, then put that out, dogs locked in on it. What I'd done is I trained the dogs that the fridge smell was part of my target, because all my targets were stored in the fridge. So as soon as I realized that, I started storing all my distractors in the fridge as well, and I proofed it often. But now what I do is I store all my targets and distractors. They're all in mason jars. They're all within their own ammunition cans, but they're exact same ammunition cans, bought from the same store, prepared the same way, and then they're all stored in the same freezer. And I actually now store them all in a freezer. And that is to prevent that issue of where the dogs learn the storage smell. So I question everything. If my dog responds on something that it's not trained to, I question why. If it does respond at 100%, I question why. Why am I making this so simple? What's going on that I'm not seeing? Like the Petri dish paper, the blotting paper, why is the dog missing that but finding these small amounts? So question everything, and always ensure, even if your training's going well, double check everything, that you're not actually training something that you shouldn't be training as a target odor. And as I said before, training is not real life. Training is training. And as much as you try and simulate real life, it's really difficult to do that. So by using double blinds, by leaving items out to naturalize, by doing everything we can to simulate as much as possible real life, at the end of the day, we can't. And if your dog does do a change in behavior on a real search, and it's had really limited exposure to real targets, I'm very happy to kind of question that. And if it's safe to do so, actually move forward and confirm, etc., and give my dog a high value reward. If it's not, then I'm going to tell my follow-up team, hey, I want you to check this area out because I'm not happy, and just leave it at that. I'm not going to say there's something there, but I'm going to say, just check it out and let's see what's going on. All right, well, I've talked for quite a long time there, tried to cover a lot of material. I am very happy to take questions. And unless Wayne has a cut off or people have to leave, I'm happy to stay on and take questions. My website address is there. My email address is there. I'm happy if people want to send me emails. Now, I will tell you, I'm slow in typing. I one finger type. And if you ask a lot of questions, it's going to take me a while to get back to you. But I do reply to all emails I get. Or, you know, if it gets too complicated, I'll just say Zoom me. It's so much easier for me to explain over a phone call. So if you do have questions, etc., either reach out or go to my website and stuff. But if we do have time, Wayne, and you're happy, I'm happy to take questions right now.
Yep, if you just click the chat button at the bottom of your screen, Paul,
Okay.
there's been a few questions typed into the chat.
But wouldn't you mix with extractor? There's a reinforcer. So, Karen, but you wouldn't mix with a distractor that is a reinforcer. I have. You know, with landmines, we mixed it with their reinforcer, with tennis balls, etc. I wouldn't necessarily do it if I didn't need to. So if I wasn't going to encounter those targets in the environment, then I wouldn't need to. So again, you know, you're going to have to look at, would I encounter my reinforcer in the environment, which, you know, potentially, let's say you have an explosive detection dog and you want to proof it off Kong as an odor during a search, or drugs detection dog, and you've learned that the local criminals are using Kongs to try, or tennis balls to try and put the dogs off, then yeah, I might. You know, at the end of the day, the reinforcer is a reward, a toy that it learns to play with. And dogs are very context aware. So if you go to Swedish Working Dog Institute, to their videos, they train, and I train actually. In fact, the part of my book, or the book that I wrote, is that train on Kong odor. And that's one of its reinforcers. You know, that's the odor out there. And then, but in this case, I'm actually discriminating against the target because I might encounter it in the field. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers your question, but I might, if I'm concerned that I'm going to encounter the reinforcer in the field and I don't want the dog to respond on reinforcer, I want it to be able to discriminate if people are using its reinforcer to try and cover where it's hiding drugs or something, and you find the ball and think, oh, my dog was after a ball, but underneath it is hidden some drugs or something. So I might, you know, again, I'm going to look at that as an individual if it's a requirement. If that didn't answer your question, Corinne, obviously write again, and I'll try and readjust it. Stu, in the odor generalization experiment, Duchamp et al., +R for ignoring source beyond desired threshold, +R for indicating source within desired. Yes. So initially, the dogs generalize themselves to a tenfold, and they would actually naturally ignore targets tenfold below or tenfold above what they had, the target level they'd been trained on. Then Duchamp actually, Dr. Duchamp actually reinforced that to say, if you ignore this level, we will give you a reinforcement. So in that case, we actually reinforced ignoring the lower and the higher levels, because what we were trying to do is calibrate the dog to actually only find a certain level. In this case, it's oil. So we want the dogs only to find a certain level of oil and ignore anything below a certain level. So we did reinforce ignoring. And in this case, it was food. So how was ignoring reinforced? We exposed the dog, and we use an olfactometer for this, which is a computer-driven device. It's got 3 ports. Again, if you go on my website or my Instagram, you can see dogs actually working this device. So certain amounts of odor were delivered to the dog, and the device can actually deliver set amounts of odor of target. And then it was reinforced if it chose correctly. And then if certain amounts were delivered and it was below what it should responded on and it walked away, it was reinforced. If it responded on it, it was given a negative. And by giving a negative, it's a sound, and said, no, that is not what you're looking for. So we actually reinforced the correct amounts or reinforced ignoring the amounts we didn't want to respond. Again, hopefully, Stu, that actually explained that. Do you teach a blank indication? Yes. And I actually spoke about this when I was on Cameron Ford's podcast, and I got a lot of negative feedback for this, but I do teach it. I think, again, I've got videos on my Instagram and things. So I teach the all clear, but it can't be used in all contexts. And I think maybe, I didn't explain why I teach it or how I teach it effectively in that other podcast. So, if I'm doing a river search like you saw in the video, I don't expect my dog to give me an all clear. I mean, contextually, it wouldn't anyway, because there is no end to the search. When I teach the carousel or stands, odor recognition, then I do teach the dog that if you work down these samples and your target isn't present, if you indicate to me it's not present and it isn't, I'm going to give you a reward. Now, I can use that if I'm working a room in a house, if I'm working a vehicle, that I can work the dog. And if the dog can't find its target, it can come back to me and say, no target present. And that is a rewardable behavior. Now, there is caveats to how you do this. I don't jackpot reward it if there's no target present. It gets a lower value reward, but it's still a reward. But it gives it the option to say there's nothing here. And, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One, we do research with these dogs, and we research targets that potentially the dogs can't detect, or there is no odor there. We just don't know what the dogs are detecting. So again, I've just finished a research project with the Navy where we did exactly that. We didn't know what components of a particular product the dogs were detecting. So we presented, or the scientists did, it was double blind. I didn't even know what was on the medium, the samples. So there was 6 placed out in stands. The dog had to go down 1 to 6. There was distractors present. There might have been a positive control, but also there was these fractions, there was components of targets, which we don't know if dogs use to find the actual product or not. Now, if I kept working the dog and it never found anything, search after search after, it's going to get frustrated and it's going to get stressed and it's going to start false responding. But if I have an option where the dog can move down those 6 stands, come back to me and say, no, I don't smell anything. Okay. There's a reward. It's not your great reward. It's not your jackpot, but okay, carry on. And then if I work it again and it finds target and I give it its jackpot, then 1, the route to its jackpot is finding target. 2, if that target is in stand 3, 4, or 5, it's going to choose that because that's the quickest way to get a reward. But also it deconflicts any stress or frustration from by not finding anything. So yeah, I do use it. I like that I use it, and I have that capability in my dogs. I use it in building search, etc. The dog can go around the room. I might present areas, but at the end of the day, if it comes back and says, I can't find anything, or there's nothing here, okay, we're moving on to the next room, and you might have a chance. And remembering that moving from room to room or vehicle to vehicle, when your dog hasn't found, is exactly that. The dog's come to the end of the search, and it might not turn and look at you, but that was a blank, and then you're moving it to the next vehicle, it has a find. All I'm doing is making it a little more formal and saying, turn around and look at me and tell me you haven't found anything. So yeah, I do teach that and I use it. Do you have a preference type of indication? As you can see, generally I teach the sit because it's a definite change in behavior. But when a dog communicates to me any change in behavior, again, as you saw in the videos, that's its indication. It's saying to me there's something here. And I first learned this when I went to Kosovo. I had a really good detection dog, Thistle, a Labrador, amazing explosive detection dog. And I'd go out on searches, and again, it goes to that transition. It was the first time we deployed out of training. We'd go on searches, and he never once on a live search gave me a beautiful sit response, which he did all the way through training. He always gave me really strong changes of behavior. And sometimes he would stand and stare and jump about or some. And I reported it, say, hey, you need to check this area out because something's going on. And they'd have fines. But in real life, the dog just never gave me that final response. Now, up in Canada, as you saw, I had 3,800 fines, I think it was. So, you know, the dogs had a lot of experience and I could wait for a sit response. Now, that dog in the video in training gives a really nice focused response at source. You can see there in real life, you know, if you're doing 183 fines in a day, yeah, it kind of falls out a bit, and I'm just going to take what you give me. I might work on it in calibration day. So day 7 of a week is calibration day. If we need to work on it, then that through the process of day in, day out, operational searches, find after find after find, if something starts to deteriorate in training that affects our operational effectiveness, then I'm going to work on it. You know, if a dog sits, turns around and looks at me, yeah, you know, in training, I might work on that, but in the field, you've done your job. I'm happy. So yeah, sit is what I like and what I teach, but I'm going to take any indication in the field. How does the ignoring reinforcement differ to indirect reinforcement for detection? How was back chaining of the distractor prevented? So I'm hoping that I understand your question. Indirect reinforcement. So again, you know, I'll use anything. I'll mark with a clicker. If you watch my videos, I mark with a clicker sometimes. As you saw in the video, I throw it in at source. I walk up to source. I drop it in at source. I'll put a flag down. I'll drop it in at source. I'll call the dog off me. I might do an emergency recall practice, even on ops. You know, on oil detection ops, I might do an emergency recall off Odour and give them a reward. The dog never knows exactly what I'm doing, and I use direct and indirect. And I have no problem with that. Again, generally, I don't take a clicker out in the field with me. It's a pain, but I use them in the lab a lot on exactly the same dogs. Poppy there in the video, Poppy, the spaniel that you saw, if you look at my videos on Instagram and stuff, you'll see I use a clicker in the lab and she's great, but I don't in the field. I mean, that I use both systems of direct and indirect reinforcement when I'm out there. So how does the ignoring reinforcement? I'm not sure I'm understanding, but you don't ignore the reinforcement in the dechant experiment because the dogs are not reinforced if they've made the right decision. So if they've smelt the target at the amount of level we want, they're reinforced. If they ignore the target at the level what we want, they're reinforced. So they're never reinforced unless they've conducted the behavior we want. I'm hoping I understand your question. That makes sense. Obviously, Stu, if not, write again, or again, you know, get in touch with me afterwards. How was back chaining of the distractor prevented? In the dechant experiment, there was no distractor. It was on generalization of levels. So it was either, here's your target, is it at the level you respond at, or here's your target at below the level you're supposed to respond at. So don't respond. So there was no distractors in that because we wasn't looking at the ability for the dogs to find the target. It was when you find the target, is it at the level you should respond at, as in odor concentration, or not? Yes or no? And that was basically it. It was a yes or no answer. And that's all the dogs had to say. Yes, that's it. And they held the nose in the port for 4 seconds and they were marked correct if it was correct, or I can smell the odor, but it's below the level that I should respond in on. And they moved away from the port and they were rewarded. So that's how that experiment actually worked. Again, hopefully, Stu, that's answered your question. All right, Wayne, that's all the questions I can see. I don't know if there's any more, but you know, if that is the questions, then thank you for your time. I appreciate it very much, and hopefully you got something from it. As I said at the start, you know, I can't provide a presentation where everyone walks away happy, but I hope you learned something. And again, I'm not saying this is the only way to do things. This is how I've learned from my experience and my understanding of what I'm seeing in the field and my understanding of some of the science we've worked on. So, you know, I use the term, it's the art of science. Dog training is the art of science. Science is important, but there is still an art to dog training. And, you know, when you go out in the field, such as the very first photo I showed, you know, how do we replicate a huge mat of odor under the ground And yet in real life, my dog's responding every 10 meters and I'm putting flags in the ground, not knowing if there's target under there or not. But that's the art side. You know, that's the part where I'm reading my dog, we're communicating together. I know what she's telling me and I'm trusting what she's telling me. And I know my training is solid and I know I've done everything I can to be as effective as I can in the field. That's what I'm doing. I'm doing the art phase. So, you know, again, art of science, again, reach out if you need to, but thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank everyone for joining today, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their day.